All right, greetings, friends and comrades. Daniel is back again, this time with Stuart Blaney, who has just written a very interesting book on the philosophy of Jacques Rancière and Michel Foucault, which is given the title by Bloomsbury of Equality and Freedom, Rancière and Foucault, forthcoming with Bloomsbury. Stuart, thank you so much for joining us on the Emancipations podcast. I have been a reader of Jacques Rancière for quite some time, although I find him such a sometimes misunderstood thinker, and at times I find him falsely sort of put into this bucket that they call French theory.
Okay.
He's usually kind of branded as a sort of late fad of so-called French theory, when that label, I think, does a lot of injustice to Jacques Rancière, the singularity of Jacques Rancière's thought, right?
Mm-hmm.
So part of what we want to do in this conversation, in addition to talking about your book on equality and freedom, which I have had the pleasure to read, is to also clarify some of Rancière's concepts, also to understand what kind of thinker Jacques Rancière is. And at the same time, also, Stuart, we want to get a sense for what motivated you to spend, because you wrote a dissertation on Jacques Rancière. And I feel that your book, by the way, I say Rancière much more than Foucault, because it feels to me that your book is much more about Rancière than it is about Foucault. Perhaps that's wrong. Perhaps that's true. I don't know. So maybe actually, if we could, Stuart, begin with that, with a bit of your personal experience with Rancière. How did you first discover him as a thinker, and what made you want to dedicate your dissertation to his thought?
So I came across Rancière by accident when I was doing my MA. Um, uh, Tutt is quite a name. Was a kind of uh, uh, visiting online, shall we say, about one of his essays, kind of amalgamating a little bit of Rancière and Foucault. And I first came across Rancière through that essay, and I was, should I say, somewhat seduced by,
Sure.
I would say, that the clarity of his thought, which I think goes right through the years and years and years and years of what is equality, and and so on and so forth. And equality and freedom can't work together, and because he basically sees equality as like a practice,
Yeah.
as does Foucault with freedom. And to me, that made a lot of sense. And like PhD wise, to be able to bring freedom and equality together, where they actually worked, but as a synergy, as a working together, rather than like diminishing each other, where they just merge into one. Really interested me, and they seem to work together. But that's not to say that to diminish from either that they can't work on their own.
Yeah, thank you. So Rancière is a thinker that was a part of the Althusserian school when he was a younger scholar.
For sure.
And perhaps we could begin with a bit of an understanding of that experience for Jacques Rancière. I was just reading Althusser's Lesson, and it's a quite remarkable book, in my opinion.
Yeah.
It gave me a certain clarity regarding what drove Althusser's theoretical interventions at the ground level, in terms of the Communist Party, in terms of the censorship during the period of Stalinism, even in the wake of Khrushchev's secret speech, in the wake of the burgeoning student movements. Althusser is sort of thrown into this milieu where he's at the École Normale Supérieure, which is a sort of elite, the most prestigious and elite French university. But he is a steadfast communist philosopher, Marxist philosopher, in a context in which French Communist Party has a great deal of censorship on theory. So Althusser's message was return to Marx, right? Not necessarily return to Marxism, right? Return to Marx, return to capital. And Jacques Rancière is one of the young students that is a part of the reading group that would compose Reading Capital, and Rancière makes his own, distinct interventions in that work. So what can you say about the early Rancière for us? Maybe to sort of set the scene, and maybe say something about his relationship to Althusser.
Okay, so I won't particularly say this is my strong sphere, the early Rancière, because obviously that's not really what I was interested in. But however, as an aside, before we start, Foucault, of course, was also a student of Althusser at one point. And they both moved away from Althusser, and they both did so by turning to the archives. They both went to the archives with different projects. So, like, as you know, and you pretty much said, Daniel, that in the 70s in France, a lot of academics were turning away from Marxism because of the PCF's, French Communist Party's negative reaction to May 68, the revelation of the gulags, in the USSR, and because with Rancière, he took it very personally. I think he was quite heartbroken the way that Althusser reacted to May 68, and he started to realize that Althusser was pretty much like the society they lived in. He was like a pedagogue, right? You had to do things a certain way, and you had to understand things a certain way and do it. There shouldn't be a revolution now. It wasn't the right time, and so on. So when he turned to the archives, and he came across by chance these worker poets, predominantly Gourney, and he's edited a book just on Gourney's work, like his letters, newspaper articles, and excerpts from books, and so on and so forth. He started to think, well, what's this? This is more like an aesthetic revolution rather than an actual political revolution, if that makes sense. And it was all about how the stress was on changing the self rather than changing the government. And that kind of made Rancière explore this area. And also, as well, according to him, he found out that, in the archives, that the workers of the 19th century didn't necessarily fit the stereotype where they wanted kind of, like liberty, equality, and so on and so forth. They just wanted to be safe from poverty, and they wanted to even be safe from working at all. That's what they wanted. They didn't want revolution. Revolution was a hardship for them. That's kind of, so that's why he all in all, remained turned away from Marx and communism and Althusser.
Yeah, this is interesting because I feel that Rancière's relationship to Marx and Marxism is more complicated in the sense that he's not an anti-Marxist, and I think that a lot of people have brandished him as an anti-Marxist. I myself am involved with these debates and these struggles in the kind of digital public sphere that this podcast is a part of.
Yeah.
You have people that have made these claims, and I prefer, Stuart, to read Rancière slightly differently. I prefer to read him as sort of a committed, as sort of committed to a project that would try to restore something in Marxism. It's true that he has an intellectual project that is sort of against Marxist teleology or against some kind of vulgar theory of So he has that, and that you could say that is what inducts Rancière into the camp of French theory, insofar as we define French theory as having an allergy to Marxism or having some movement away.
Yeah.
But I think that things are a bit more complex in the sense that what Rancière derives in terms of philosophy, political thought, his theses on politics, his aesthetic theory, after having gone back into the archive, he chooses the time period from basically the rise of industrial capitalism in the 1820s, 1830s to 1848. And I felt that that's a very interesting time period to focus on, right?
It's when he was,
Because
they were building the railways. That was a specific time when all the railways were being built. So that was the real extreme, like, industrial revolution happening right then.
and if you read his books, The Philosopher and His Poor, as well as, which is much more, The Philosopher and His Poor is something beyond just the archive. It's really a look at how, from Plato through Marx, philosophers have had a hierarchy of relegating worker intellectuals to outside of a certain, regime of intelligibility or regime of sensibility. And we'll get into this concept that he develops, but his other book called Proletarian Nights, as well as his book on Goni, is much more about pulling together an archive of these voiceless worker thinkers, worker poets, worker philosophers. And I felt that, okay, one does not need to have an ideological reading of a philosopher in order to benefit from him. So, for example, if you're listening and you are a committed Marxist, such as myself, I think it's important to note that what Rancière's work on worker intellectuals actually offers a lot of insight for Marxism, you know? So this idea of maybe we shouldn't start with saying, oh, he's an anti-Marxist. You see my point? No, because actually what Rancière is giving is something very profound to what Alain Badiou, one of Rancière's contemporaries, calls the kind of emancipatory tradition. Like the revolutionary tradition. So Rancière is developing a new theory of the meaning of liberation, of the meaning of emancipation, which is not to be understood in an ideological valence. In other words, it's not to be understood as like, this is a project that is meant to sap the vitality of Marxism. I don't think that's a proper reading. I don't think he would accept that. Do you agree?
No,
you see my point of a reading method. We don't want to have an ideological reading method.
I definitely think he's not, got an axe to grind with Marx, so to speak. I mean, he's steeped in Marx. I mean, for Althusser, he was very much a man of his time. But, it's all about emancipation with Rancière. You're 100% correct. There's different interpretations of Rancière. You're 100% right. So for me, with Rancière, it's not philosophy as a way of life; it's emancipation as a way of life, and that's why for me, I focus on his idea of dissensus, which is the disruption and suspension of the normative, the consensus, as an everyday affair. Not this charging of a Winter Palace or whatever, but it's an everyday practice, right? Okay, because emancipation is a way of life. And I very much see that as well with Foucault, his practices of freedom as well. And, Foucault, as we all know, he turns away from Marxism as well. So I don't think, I agree with you, but, Rancière is very, critical of Marx in various ways. Like Marx was still, much like Camus and other people as well, nothing new. He doesn't say anything particularly new, but Marx was all about production. The worker was getting even more work. Then, of course, there's a dialectic, which forever defers emancipation or defers equality, and equality should happen here and now. And the only way it can happen right here and now is as a practice. So I understand what you're saying, and he's very much in the vein of emancipation. You're 100% right, but whether he's quite trying to do anything with Marxism, I don't know, because as well, Rancière himself says that his form of emancipation is very much for the individual. Yeah, it can expand with what he calls aesthetic communities, but as you probably know, they're not locational, are they? Right? Okay, they're spread out, much like with Goni and other worker poets. They had these aesthetic communities, so you're reading Goni's work in a worker newspaper, for example, or so on and so forth. Or there's meetings, but there's not a locational community, a bit like Nancy talks about, right? So
That's helpful.
it's, yeah, it's very different in that sense. He says himself, it's for the individual, because unlike Marx, right, he doesn't believe that society can change as a whole. For him, society will always be um, working on a presupposition of inequality. Therefore, emancipation is continual. It's a never-ending process. It's a way of life.
Yeah, that's very helpful, and I think we're starting to get into the conceptual register. I wanted to start with maybe, foregrounding this archival research, and we can touch upon it before we, hop into, because at the heart of Rancière's theory of dissensus and aesthetics is,
Yes.
of course, it is a philosophical theory. It is dealing with Kant's theory of judgment and imagination and aesthetics as well. But one writer on Rancière's work of 19th century worker intellectuals had the following to say, and I want to read this to you to capture your thoughts on it. Romantic descriptions of emotional torment and the unhappy passions, when read from the perspective of one's dominated position in the productive order, harbor more subversive power than scientific critiques of political economy. In other words, utopian socialists, including communists, had a theory of science, of the liberation of humanity.
Yeah, for sure.
However, Rancière's investigations into marginal, unknown thinkers who were interested in emancipation, sure, they're interested in collective emancipation, but because their voices were not included into the consensus, their conceptions of emancipation were ignored. That then means something regarding science, right? The science of emancipation. I thought you might want to comment on that or say something about that. Have you thought about that? Because in a certain way, this, by the way, is very much related to Althusser's critique of science as well, in a certain way. How do you understand that point? Of what Rancière is trying to draw attention to, because he's really upending. I'll say this final thing and ask you to comment. We often have a myth, of the worker, which is
the artisan.
But well, I would even say, like, you see this in Stalinism, where Stalin and the Soviets invented a work ethic based on a kind of national pride in the Soviet system, right? In other words, they had to develop a myth that the worker enjoys their work, that they get pleasure out of that work, so long as it is, compensated properly, better than in capitalism, let's say, right? And Jacques Rancière, through his work in the archive, really upends a lot of these theories about a harmonious relationship that the worker would have to work, even for so-called petty bourgeois workers. So that's another thing that I really found interesting about Rancière, is that his studies of the 19th century upend a lot of our assumptions, about class, But let's move to this point here about worker intellectuals and science. If you have any thoughts on that.
Worker intellectuals and science. Well, from what I know from the Guni's archival work, which was kind of like an experimental historiography, right, where he's not being the voice for these people; they're being their own voice. He stresses, like, the time to live at that time as a proletariat, a worker, was horrendous, probably beyond our comprehension, right? It was a horrendous time. And for many of them, revolution kind of made it worse, right? It made it worse, okay? And this is like, what Camus said in the 50s, and a lot of people against Albert Camus were saying, right, French Revolution, Napoleon, and so on and so forth, and the horrors of revolution. He talks about having a rebellion instead of revolution, and aesthetics. There's some kind of congruence there, an indirect one with him and Rancière, and Foucault as well, I would argue. That they wanted to be educated for a love of education. They're autodidacts, right? Which is an intrinsic part of Rancière's work, to be autodidactic rather than listen to pedagogues that apparently because you can't understand what you should do. So if there was a science, it was being an autodidact and carrying out, an auto-emancipation, an emancipation of the self by the self. And I don't really think, and maybe I'm wrong, and people will say otherwise. There's a real science behind their thought. They just wanted an emancipation from everything that was happening, but they didn't believe that revolution, political revolutions, away because they suffered through that, so they wanted to work on themselves. And if there's a science to that, if you want to call it science, okay. But Rancière prefers to call it like a work of poets. Yeah, it's a poetry as well, because the etymon of poetry means creation, right? But creation of another life, of another self, so to speak. They didn't want to emancipation for the taxonomy that was imposed upon them as worker. They wanted an emancipation from that taxonomy itself. Yeah. Which is that's
exactly
what they wanted.
Exactly. In other words, you could say that the discourses on emancipation that make, and this I think is the rational kernel that Rancière bequeaths to us, that offers something to us, which is that our formulas for liberation, especially when they are couched in the language of when they make a pretense to a science of liberation, like when I say science, I mean historical materialism, for example. Engels, right? Scientific socialism or utopian. That's the wager that Engels makes. So, of course, I am a partisan for the science of socialism. I'm for that. I agree with Marx and Engels' critique of the pitfalls of utopian socialism, right? I agree with that in theory. Okay, but Rancière is pointing something. You see, what this conversation is about is the subtlety of reading methods. You see, because we don't want to draw his conclusions here from these worker intellectuals of the 19th century to some kind of project of anti-Marxism. I think actually what we should try to do is allow it to strengthen Marxism. Yeah, because he's identified a form of alienation, is what I understand. And so let's talk about that alienation for Goni. For example, Rancière has this concept of the cenobitic economy, which was a very interesting concept, which was this worker intellectual was he was a tiler. He tiled floors, right? He laid floors. And
laid like wooden floors, like the long wooden panels of floors. Yeah.
So that was his trade, right? That's what he did.
Yeah.
But Rancière says that he would structure his week to take time off from this very laborious activity, so that he could write, so that he could enter into a space of thought as a type of escape. And he talks about the walks that he would go on and the reading his diary and but you see, he's pinpointing that separation that that Goni is making. And I just felt like like how much that resonates with a lot of the experience that intellectuals have in today's time, insofar as after 2008, capitalism has forced regiments of labor and austerity onto people to such a degree that it really resonates. You know what I mean? And that also then resonates with the fact that worker ideology, like the question of how one organizes alienated workers towards a project that would be for their emancipation at a collective level, is a struggle. But you see, Rancière shows why it is a struggle, because he's showing that at this subjective level, there's another struggle going on that you're not seeing.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to you?
No, totally.
Do you please respond as you think you wish.
Well, this is why Guni and talks about himself in the third person, because Rancière here says he's trying to create a double of himself, right? Okay. And I don't know if, like, retrospectively, like now, I think sometimes it might resonate somewhat with Dubois, when this Dubois talks about double consciousness, right? And that might relate in to return to Hegel and like the unhappy consciousness and so on and so forth. But that's to diverge. So it's all well and good to say, let's have a revolution and so on and so forth. Like this, I'm pretty basic here, but like people have to survive. They got their biological body, right? You could say their consensual body, their social body, and they got their dissensual body, the body of dissensus. So Guni is very much a double. He's a worker, poet. He's a worker, but not really a worker. He's a poet, but not really a poet. But the two together, So when he takes these walks of reverie, as you say, he's carrying out an act of dissensus, because in that time period, early 19th century, it's a work day. He's not working. He's walking through parts of Paris that are affluent. So he's kind of breaking this consensual time and space at the same time. And he's creating life as a double through this Cenobitic economy, which is basically where he's very, very frugal. He talks about, you live in the suburbs because it's cheaper there. And, don't buy too much food. He was a vegetarian and this and that. And he basically gives a 101 of how to survive on this Cenobitic economy and buy stuff at the market. It's cheaper. And only get when you get your clothes laundered, iron them yourself and so on and so forth. All of this basic stuff. But it's so he can have, because he's like self-employed. So if he doesn't work, he doesn't get paid. So he gets days where there's no work. But he wants to have the money to survive that, so he can do that which he wishes to and become that double, become that poet. And there were other workers like that. And I don't think, Daniel, respectfully, that they really wanted to change the world, right? You talk about the myth of the artisan loving their job, the myth of the worker wanted, liberty, fraternity, and so on. They just wanted to escape poverty. That's all they basically wanted, to be what they wanted to do, right? And so Guni creates himself as this double. And Rancière says that the main thing he learned from Guni was that definition of worker is someone whose time is taken from them. But what Guni showed him is that you can take that time back. So after work, instead of Guni going home and relaxing or whatever, that's when he read, that's when he wrote. And so did other plebeian philosopher. He calls himself a plebeian philosopher. And worker poets did. They took that time back. They became autodidactic. That's why, in a sense, it's very Foucauldian, because it's an ethics of the self almost, I would say.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting, because at stake in the desire, you could say, the desire of worker, is an acknowledgement that recognition through the mainstream, let's say, consensus model, or even you might say bourgeois models, are inadequate, right? In other words, when one reads Rancière's archival research of these figures, one gets the sense that, they already had a decided point regarding recognition, that it was not going to happen. They already knew that their dignity was deprived to them.
Yeah.
So when you say the tradition of radical liberalism from, say, Jacobinism, of freedom, equality, liberty, and so on, in Rancière's figures, they already have a fundamental skepticism regarding the fulfillment of that representational possibility, right? And that, I think, is a good way of understanding what the meaning of dissensus is. Yeah. Now, at the same time, what then is equality for Rancière if equality is found in a break from the big maximal equality. Yeah. The big maximal equality. No, equality is actually found slightly to the side of that. But I think it's important to say, and I want you to comment on this, what equality is for Rancière. I think it's important to say, though, hold on, that it's not to say that these big maximal forms of equality, right? The ones that make possible the commune, the ones that make possible revolution. You don't want to suggest that Rancière is necessarily antagonistic to that, because that would make Rancière like Edmund Burke or something, and that's not what we want to say. You see my point? It's subtle. Please.
Yeah. Okay. So this is my interpretation, maybe, of Rancière. Maybe it leans too much towards Foucault, because maybe in the book they kind of blur together my synergy, and maybe it's due to my own interests, which very much of emancipation is a way of life. As an individual, of course, in line with other things as well that are more for the masses. But in a nutshell, I would say, first of all, for anyone who doesn't know about Rancière, the whole of his philosophy revolves on the axis of equality, right? It's all about equality. However, it's not the equality that we typically understand. You say maximal, I would say it's not equality as an ideal. It's not an ideal. It's all about equality as two things: a presupposition, which is a key term I'm going to return to shortly, and a practice. Now, we've touched on practice, right? Praxis as the everyday, which Blaney shows. Just quoted the in praxis, another big acts of revolution. But it's also a presupposition where you presuppose that you are equal. Therefore, you do not ask for equality to be given to you. You presuppose it, and you act as if you are equal. So a prime example, a good example of this that Tutt gives in his book on Rancière is in America, in your country, in the civil rights movement, where African Americans went to white-only establishments, restaurants, and so on, and presupposed their equality by sitting there and ordering food. They presupposed that they were equal. They didn't demand equality. They didn't believe in it as an ideal. They presupposed it. Yeah, just much like Blaney did, where he's this worker who had to, autodidactically teach himself, and he became a published poet, which is no mean feat for someone who had the education that he had and came from the background that he did. So equality is not an ideal, therefore it is not deferred. Yeah, it's not something to reach or something to aspire to. It's something that happens now. It's a presupposition, and it's taken, and it happens here and now, right now, in the present moment. Yeah, and the civil rights is a good example, but Blaney is another example of everyday forms of dissensus, what he calls dissensus, which is his neologism stemming from the Latin etymon dissensus, which means disagreement. Disagreement. So there's this tension between the dissensus and the consensus. Does that kind of answer you?
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, that does, because one of Rancière's maxims is, well, you could understand it by upending a common assumption that I think we encounter in Marxism regarding equality, which is the idea that, and I'm not saying Rancière would disagree with this, by the way, but you hear this a lot, and I think it's interesting, which is that bourgeois equality is sort of subordinated to a kind of limited or false form of equality, because ultimately bourgeois equality doesn't care to interrogate the market and its domination over our lives.
Yeah.
Therefore, a form of equality is hidden, but a form of inequality as an ideal that the masses can galvanize around. Well, what Rancière shows is that there's also a form of imminent, you could call it imminent equality, and that might not be his language. Yeah,
That's
I
correct.
guess that does work. Yeah, that
Yeah,
that
that's a
is
perfect term.
yeah, that is because you see what he's upending or what he's challenging is the telos of the
Yeah,
idea of equality, which would be
yeah,
this notion of deferred. So
yeah,
emancipation is therefore this individual act. It's very compelling. Now, why aesthetics? Why aesthetics? Where does that come from? And how do you sort of introduce this concept? Like what you see my point? Look,
yeah.
why does he want to say that the workers movement could be best understood as an aesthetic movement? What's the story with that?
Okay, so before uh, going to that, I just want to touch on briefly. I wrote this down what you said because it pretty much got to the point. So it's the aesthetic revolution is imminent. Yeah, it unlike this we're talking about Marxism, so let's talk about that for example. That's more like in a way it's transcendent, isn't it? Yeah, this political revolutions transcend something, right? Where imminent revolutions like work, like Foucault talks about the same, this imminence. Um, because like for Foucault and Rancière, and people might argue otherwise, but history shows us that most political revolutions are merely a shift in power. Yeah, power just changes hands. Okay, people might disagree with that, but there's examples in history. So for them, Rancière and Foucault, it's very much about immanence. So immanence, as you quite rightly say, plays a very big part. And with this aesthetic revolution, like a revolution of the self, if you like, um, this is a form of immanence. Now, you talk about aesthetics. So aesthetics for Rancière is intrinsically linked with dissensus. So let me try and flesh out a little bit what aesthetics is for Rancière. So for Rancière, first of all, just like he has a different understanding of equality to how we, the average person, might understand equality as a practice and not as an ideal. Aesthetics is not a philosophical study of beauty and taste. Okay, so I made a note of this in a 2016 interview. He's very succinct, and he states that aesthetics is one's relationship with the perceived world. One's relationship with the perceived world. So when he writes of aesthetics, he's referring to the aesthetic sphere of human experience and how we make sense of that which we sense. So he calls the configuration of how we make sense of what we sense the distribution of the sensible, which is a very famous term of his, which is a sharing out and an allocating of the sensible. But obviously that happens unequally. It's also a forming of the way we think and what we do, what's thinkable, what's doable, and the way we perceive the world and others. Therefore, for Rancière, the domination of the consensus in its unequal configuration is not repressive, but productive. Much like Foucault says that we're not oppressed as subjects, but we're produced, right? Okay, we're produced as subjects, and this is what he says about the aesthetic and domination of the consensus. So this is when he writes of aesthetic revolution as a reconfiguration of the configuration of the sensible. That's the means of emancipation. So he says, and I've made a note of this as well, in his dissensus on politics and aesthetics, emancipation can be seen as the autonomy of experience of the self and of the world, and how we make sense of that which we sense. So it's reconfiguring that form of aesthetics that's imposed upon us within socio-space and time, and how we make sense of the world around us. So let me try and slow down a little bit. I'm talking a little bit
Yeah,
too
no,
quickly.
that's very
So
helpful. Could I ask a question
yeah,
for clarification? So
yeah.
this is very, very helpful, Stu. We have this idea in political economic thought of what's called division of labor. Yeah.
Yeah.
And is it possible to understand what Rancière means by the partitioning of the sensible, right? This
Yeah.
idea is very interesting if you think about it, because what he's talking about is that there are unacknowledged hierarchies imposed on collective sensibility, right? In other words,
Yeah.
in an inegalitarian society such as our own,
Yeah.
we may realize it, we may not. There is a regime of consensus that governs what is permissible. This is ultimately what Rancière would call the police. There's
Yeah.
a kind of so could you explain a little bit more about the meaning of the consensus? Like Rancière has a book called Disagreement. You might want to elaborate the various forms of politics that might help us, that Rancière develops, stretching back in the ancient Greeks. I think he even goes to the pre-Socratics, right, to understand that. But it's a very compelling idea. I mean, it's also a very powerful form of critique to have that conception. That in other words, that the division of labor almost has a superimposition on sense. That's a very is that a fair way to read that? Is he sort of making that claim?
Well,
Like,
I mean,
you know what I mean?
part of the aesthetic would be like, I don't know if we can use it's a loaded word, but hierarchy. Okay, it's this division not just of social space and time, because if you're let's say upper class and working class, you have a very different amount of social space and time. Yeah, and one of the reasons I would argue that it's important to carry these out, these like quotidian, these everyday acts of dissensus, because it's the everyday that imposes these. Yeah, and it's almost hidden in the everyday because it just becomes the norm. That's what's around you. So it's your everyday. I would argue duty, but maybe that's a strong to try and carry out dissensus against that imposition of this unequal aesthetics that's imposed upon us. But you want to talk about the consensus a little bit in politics. So one of the things Rancière says is a consensus is imposed as univocal, or some people say univocal. That there's only one truth, and this is it, and you must consent to it. Okay. So his idea of dissensus is imposing another truth, or if you like, another fiction. The two in French theory are contronymic, aren't they? Yeah, truth is fiction, and fiction is truth. So what he does is he goes to look at three types of politics, of political philosophers, because as you know, and you say in The Philosopher and His Poor, he criticizes political philosophy, that you're using the work of the underprivileged to give yourself this position as the all-knowing theorist, and which was Jacques a Marxist, but Jacques critiqued Marx himself for this, being this all-knowing and only understands, and this is what you need to do. That's a critique by Jacques of Marx as well, but Rancière critiques other thinkers for this too. So he gives three archetypes of politics in a synopsis in his Disagreement, Politics and Philosophy. And these are archepolitics, parapolitics, and metapolitics. So with archepolitics, I mean, I would say as well, to agree with you, that one of his key enemy, if you like, his arch enemy, is not Marx, it's Plato. So that lies in congruence with what you said. So with archepolitics is a politics that Plato offers in Book 3 of the Republic. So Plato's very much about social stratification. He talks about the noble lie. It's not the truth, but it's noble because it leads to justice, because the Republic's all about justice. And famously, it's the three metals of the soul. You've got bronze and iron for workers, silver for the auxiliaries, and to implement the will of the rulers, and gold for rulers. Okay, so it's an autocratic politics that rejects democracy. Yeah, Plato arguably was very much against democracy and saw it as the totalitarian of the masses. After it was democracy that killed his teacher, Socrates. Okay, so that's the first form that he fleshes out, and then he moves on to parapolitics, and we're still with the Greeks, and this is Aristotle, and he says that this is less anti-democratic than Plato's form of political philosophy, if you like, but it's still very much a passive rather than an active equality. And that's something I should have mentioned earlier, that the census is very much presupposing that equality is very much active. You take that equality. It's not passive. You don't wait for it to be given to you. Pretty much like going off course. And Rancière doesn't mention this, but Gramsci talks about a passive revolution.
Yeah,
which is when kind of the government. I'll give you an example. And Rancière doesn't talk about this, but I'll give you this example. Civil rights movement, right? Okay, so eventually the government comes along and says, okay, yes, we're going to stop this, and there's not going to be white only establishments and so on anymore. But once they take hold of that and they do that and they bring this law out, this racism still continues throughout, and is still there in America now. It's a passive revolution, whereas the census, the way the people acted before going to white establishments and so on, was very much an active equality. So he's saying about parapolitics with Aristotle is still passive, where only the state can give you equality. And it does so to stay in power by, as Rancière would say, by appearing to benefit the people, which again, we can go back to the civil rights movement. So for me, not for Rancière, this kind of links to Gramsci's understanding of passive revolution in his prison notebooks. And there's other examples as well. I've noted one down. So, for example, the India's independence movement, emancipation from the British. Most Indians did not actively participate in negotiations for independence. So once India had independence from colonial rule, its social hierarchies, which we all know are extreme, and vast disparities in wealth, remained mostly unchanged. So for Rancière, as he states in his disagreement, parapolitics is a politics where oligarchies stay in power by appearing to act for the benefit of the people in a deferred future equality that legitimizes equality in the present now. We don't have equality now, but we're working towards it, and so on and so forth, which kind of links to the Enlightenment and this whole idea of progress to come, and equality to come. So that's his second archetype. And then the last one, we're back to Marx, is metapolitics. So this is one premise, according to him, on a social truth. And he cites Marx as an example because he criticizes politics as something that hides via ideology, that's which makes society function, economic exploitation, surplus value, and so on and so forth. So metapolitics is a discourse on the falseness of politics. And Rancière exemplifies neoliberalism as a type of metapolitics because as well it puts economy over politics, which, you say about Rancière not particularly going against Marx. I kind of agree with that, but he does criticize Marx of doing the same. He puts economy, production over politics, with a stress on production to reach equality in a historical material dialectic. So while Marx addressed the alienation of the sale of labor, he did not address the principle of labor itself and the alienation involved in this. And like Camus said this as well, Baudrillard, it's not just Rancière. These are I guess would be classic critiques. They're nothing new. Now, Rancière's definition of politics doesn't fall under any of the above terms because he stresses that all of these still form under the consensus. And for him, politics is always about dissensus. It's never about consensus. So politics is for the demos, not the polis, not the government. He writes in a few remarks on Jacques Rancière, where he's writing about himself in the third person, much like Gaudi. Politics can certainly be described as an ontological conflict, as it is a question of constructing a real in opposition to another. But for him, equality can never be institutionalized, which is what Todd May talks about in his book. What everyone seems to want to do with Rancière is they can't seem to say, well, but this isn't leading anywhere. Where's the project? Where's the emancipation? He doesn't tell us how to emancipate ourselves. So Todd May talks about institutionalizing a presupposition of equality. But then Rancière would say, well, as soon as you do that, it's part of the consensus and it will no longer be a presupposition. It has to remain within the dissensus. So it's always ongoing. We will always live in a state of inequality. And that's why his particular form of emancipation is always going to be valid, no matter what society you live in. As he says, some police are less worse than others, but you're always going to need this presupposition of equality and dissensus, because you're always going to live in inequality. There's no end to this.
That's very helpful, Stu. A couple points. One is, so yeah, metapolitics.
Yeah.
And obviously there's, if for folks that are interested, just as a reference, metapolitics is also a term used by Alain Badiou, but like many things with Badiou and Rancière, they have a shared lexicon of concepts, but they differ quite dramatically in how they theorize those concepts, right? So there's a wonderful series of exchanges that I could recommend, and maybe I'll link to it for the Patreon listeners, and I'll link to it in our show notes as well, because I actually studied with Badiou myself, and that's actually where I first learned about Rancière's work, through his engagement with him. And obviously, one of the things that is important to understand in this distinction of metapolitics and its inadequacy is what Rancière calls the part of no part. And that part of no part is very compelling, because it's sort of, well, I guess I could summarize it like this. Rancière's theory of the proletariat, in some sense, as a sort of historical, it's not like a class per se, but it's sort of like a force or a tendency within society that brings what Rancière calls a certain wrong, which the consensus will not acknowledge, right? And he uses a kind of neologism to name that wrong. I think this is a beautiful concept. In other words, what I find beautiful about it is that Rancière is giving us a theory for destabilizations and revolutions from below, in some way.
Imminent, as you say.
Imminent expressions of collective dissensus, maybe one way to put it. Whereby, if the status of the part of no part, of those who have no voice, and so on, for parapolitics, their claim would be, like the liberal politics would be, well, we can create a system that will include all marginal voices. That's liberal politics, right? Rancière's point would be, well, inequality is of a magnitude that it would actually, that this promise is never going to be met, right? And moreover, there's you can rely on this, what he calls part of no part. So now I'm inviting you to sort of, say something about this idea, and how does the part of no part also relate to this concept you said of ontology, of political ontology, or does it?
Okay, so the part without part in French, my bad pronunciation is sans part, I think, which is calls it. And those without part, shall we say, you talk about ontology. So let's just stress that with Rancière, because ontology is a loaded word, right? So maybe unpack this a little bit. For Rancière, he says somewhere, like, if you talk about ontology, where we're talking about the being of being, kind of like Heideggerian being in time, that's not what I'm interested in. He doesn't specify, but I would give the term that he's very much interested in a creative ontology, which I know is something that you're interested in, because you write about, like, Nietzsche, and Nietzsche offers his ontology of becoming is a creative ontology, with a signpost of, like, the Übermensch and the will to power and so on and so forth. So a creative ontology. Remember, we said earlier that the word poet stems from the Greek etymon, that means to create. Okay, so creation of the self and aesthetic communities and practices of equality. So it's ontological in that sense, that it's creative, not descriptive. Okay, so it's a way to be rather than a way to describe how to be, if that makes sense. So most of us, I would say, are supernumeraries. Yeah, you know, you get in the opera, the supernumerary. They're the person who just happens to be there, but they never sing anything, they never say anything. In movies, you would call it an extra. We're all extras, right? We don't really have much part in this film, this movie called The Consensus. So we're those without parts, okay, in the sharing out and allocating of the sensible. So when we start to create ourselves through an auto emancipation and auto didactic practices, and also what I call self-tutelage, right? So tutelage means not only an instruction of someone, but an authority over someone. If we have a self-tutelage, we have an instruction of oneself through auto-telic practices, and also an authority through auto emancipation. We start to counteract that and consensus production of the aesthetic by actually creating aesthetically things ourselves, especially in our disruption of the consensual space and time, much like Gorny with his walks of reverie that you mentioned. Does that make sense, Daniel, or not really?
It makes great sense. No. I get it. In other words, the part of no part, therefore, would be. I always think of it kind of like that which the consensus is incapable of naming or controlling, that which somehow, like eludes the masters in some way. And but my okay, so here's my question then: how does Rancière historicize this concept, if that's the right term? In other words, is the part of no part Rancière's theory for, like, is it kind of like to be understood as kind of like a logic of social revolt? Because you could say that, well, parapolitics, or sort of, hegemonic politics,
Yeah, for sure.
they can create strategies to pacify the part of no part.
Passive revolution, yeah.
And you know, and that's true. Obviously, that's very true, right? That's sort of that's the interesting dialectic between the revolutionary tradition and liberalism, I would say, because liberalism is anti-revolutionary. In other words,
Yeah.
liberalism will learn from the left and their revolutionary ideas so as to better suppress the real revolution, right?
Yeah.
So that's the art of politics in some sense, right?
Yeah.
But it's a struggle over the contention that the part of no part brings to the social order. So is Rancière saying that contention, that dissensus, is a truth? Yeah. How does he understand, therefore, truth of the part of no part? Does that make sense? Because he doesn't want to say that the proletarian part of no part always is on the side of truth, because if he said that, that might sound rather Christian, right? Which is, well, your truth is an expression of your suffering.
Yeah.
That's not what he's saying. But what is he saying about truth? Does that make sense to you?
Kind of. Yeah. So let me just meander into this. Just making some notes here as you're speaking. So for me, like the sum part, those who are part without part. Okay. For me as well, that means, like Foucault, he very much wants, Rancière is very distant from identity politics, right? Okay. Because identity politics, you're actually perpetuating the very thing that makes you, peripheral. So you're fighting for the very thing that pushes you down. So that's why, like he said about Gorny, they don't want emancipation for that that taxonomy worker or whatever it is that you're taxonomized as a social subject. They want emancipation from that taxonomy itself. If you're fighting from that taxonomy, you're fighting from the very prison, like Foucault called it, the modern soul, discipline and punish. Yeah, the modern soul. The body's imprisoned in the soul, and people are fighting for this taxonomy. And so both of them disagree with that. So when you get the sans-part, you get this like level playing field, right? We're all those without parts. You know, we're not the workers. We're not, you know, fighting for gay rights. We're not this. We're all in this together, right? Okay. So I think that plays a part in it. When it comes to what he calls disagreement, to me, that's similar to what Foucault calls an agonism, which comes from the Greek etymon agon, which means struggle. There's this constant struggle, one never to be resolved. It's always going to be there. So when it comes to equality, I don't think so much it's a truth. It's not an ontological fact that we should be equal. That's not where he's coming from. It's a presupposition. Where does he come from, this presupposition? Well, he comes from two stances. One of a supposition of equality of intelligence, and one of aesthetic creation. Now, the aesthetic creation, I would argue that he gets that from the work of poets. You see, we're all capable of aesthetically creating, okay? There's an equality there. And famously, that doesn't seem to get looked at too much. Famously, most people look at, with his book, The Ignorant Schoolmaster, about the 19th century pedagogue Joseph Jacotot, who kind of shows through his pedagogy that actually, like, there's a supposition of intelligence, or there's an equal intelligence. When he shows how these people he taught in Belgium can become like semi-autodidactic. They can teach themselves, and the teacher can teach that which he doesn't know. And as he fleshes out, this proves there's a supposition of intelligence. So he runs with this for a presupposition of equality as a whole. So it's not an ontological truth or a truth per se. It's a presupposition. So I don't think he's coming from the stance of truth. He's coming from the stance of presupposition of equality.
Okay. So in other words, yeah, because Rancière, he challenges me. He challenges me in this regard, and I actually want to know, maybe if we could shift slightly to your own, like maybe even semi-autobiographical, if you would be so willing. Like, what I wanted to ask you, like, what does Rancière challenge in you? Because I for me, I come from a kind of working class background, okay?
Me too.
And as such, yeah, I harbor a dream of something like class consciousness. Like, in other words, I believe that our world has a lot of prohibitions on the achievement of working class politics, of coordinating class interests for developing a new arrangement of power, a new expression of what's possible. And so Rancière challenges me in the sense that I understand, after reading Disagreement and a lot of his books, really, that, on the one hand, this subjective experience of workers, while they may have that same desire that I just articulated for myself, it doesn't necessarily result in a great harmony. There's something that blocks that harmony. There's something that blocks that achievement, that possible achievement. And that's a sobering fact. For me, that doesn't mean that my desire is going to go away for that. I will always have that view. You know my point? Like, but I wish to have that view without any kind of religious messianism or some kind of this is another thing where he keeps
eschatology. Maybe if you say that you don't want to become eschatology,
or even the idea that working class individuals are somehow more righteous, or they have more truth. I want to avoid that. right? But at the same time, I think Marxism is interesting in this regard, especially the philosopher like Lukács, because
Mm.
Lukács has this idea that in fact there's a kind of knowledge that is born from the experience of exploitation in a certain way, which Rancière theorizes, okay, as this partitioning of the sensible, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that shared partitioning of the sensible, right? That partitioning of the sensible of a form of aesthetic truth outside of the consensus. Like Goni, for example, and he's a very old man, and he says,
Mm.
even before he's about to die, and I think in his 70s, he's very
Mm.
old, he lives a long life. He says,
It's like early 80s.
he says, I'm on the cusp of transforming myself. And then he
Yeah.
says, so his project of becoming is never finished. But then he says something very interesting, which is ultimately the world can't really understand my discourse, my production. So he also recognizes that. But then my question would be, well, then who can recognize the voiceless? Like, and is the production of aesthetics of the voiceless, will Rancière qualify that as a form of truth, even like an outlaw truth or a truth that has no? Because you see, the point would be an aesthetic community, like you have that concept of counter public.
Mm.
You have
Mm.
public sphere, but then you have counter public spheres.
Mm.
Public spheres that go against the consensus.
Mm.
So does Rancière want to say something that those aesthetic communities are producing? Like, what's the novelty of what they produce? Is it purely to satisfy one another? Is it purely a kind of ludic or pleasurable thing?
Playful.
Like, what you see my point? Like, what if you have an aesthetic community of the part of no part?
Mm. Yeah.
What are they producing? What's the quality of what they produce?
Well, first of all, if you want to be marked like an extreme, you could say they don't want to produce anything because they're against production, right? Kind of playing on that, but anyway. So it's quite slippery. The aesthetic community. It's about occupying a heterological space and time, and to me, in the consensual time, it's all about teleology. We do something for a purpose, right? And it's got an end result. And very much equality is autotelic. It's an end in its own right. Yeah, it doesn't. There's no telos. It's not deferred. It's autotelic. It's a self end. Okay, so it operates within the heterological, if you like, of time and other space. Heterotopias, not utopias. Heterochronies, and so on and so forth. So by that very act, it's a form of dissensus. But then you've got like-minded people, for example, with Guni and other worker poets and so on and so forth, who are, helping to transform each other. And recently, I don't know if I'm on the right track here, and I'm totally. Rancière doesn't say anything like this, but this is my idea. It's almost Epicurean, right? This whole idea of Epicurean friendship. You're getting away from society as a whole, but it's an abstract Epicureanism because it's not locational. Epicurean were the garden philosophers in the garden, and to me that makes sense, and that kind of links up to which interests me as well, Althusser, because Althusser eventually became and thought that which his students Foucault and Rancière did by going to Epicurus himself and talking about aleatory encounters, and he was using that to go against this material dialecticism of Marx and so on and so forth. So that's a little aside where it links up. So to me, I would say that's where he's coming from. But to repeat myself, I think it's all a presupposition. Maybe I'm missing something here, but I don't remember ever reading, and I haven't read everything that Rancière has written, talking about a truth And this is talking about truth, as I said, contronymic as a fiction, where we can create new fictions, right? It's all about a presupposition of equality, and equality as a practice. That, to me, is the core of his form of emancipation.
That's very helpful. That's very helpful. Now, what about time? How would you introduce the concept of time or temporality? I mean, you've already alluded to it by talking about the hetero. It's not so much a utopia, but a heterotopia in some sense, right? It's not that Rancière is against utopia.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, that Goni, by the way, was a part of socialist utopian communes. He was part of the Fourierist and Saint-Simon, right?
Yeah.
And he related to those utopian projects in a very interesting way. He sort of, well, I guess you could say he was alienated by them, but he related to them because they were sort of a source of welfare for him.
Yeah.
They kind of gave him a touch of a community, however flawed they may be, but it was like a mutual aid connection. They kind of, he could stay the night there and maybe receive some medical care or something like that, which the state didn't provide, right? But other than that, they didn't satisfy him aesthetically.
Well,
so anyways, maybe that's right, fair to say, maybe not. How does time fit into this, though?
Okay. So, as I said, to repeat, for Rancière, who talks about space and time, I would say he admits himself his key focus is time. Where you get Foucault is focusing on the self and truth. That's very much a Foucault focus. Rancière is on the self and time. And he states, like, as he said, the definition of a worker is someone who has time taken away from them. Gouni showed me, the work of poet showed me that time can be taken back. Okay, so it's getting away from this consensual time to heterochronies, like heterotopias. And other, hetero means other, as we know, and other time. So in this other time and space, we can suspend the consensual time and space. And as I mentioned earlier, this is an autotelic space and time, because equality for him is autotelic. There's no telos, it's a self-telos. And this is the space and time that I would argue aesthetic communities operate within. But these are liquid worlds because they're flowing within this time. They don't solidify it into a location or otherwise. And as I mentioned earlier, like there's a similarity here indirectly to like Nancy and ideas of inoperative communities, that kind of idea. So for me, this I find it quite difficult to articulate, but for me, it's almost as if he creates, talks about other space and time, heterological space and time. He talks about them as minuscule machines that we can use to fight against, if you like, the machine of space and time that's imposed upon us, that, as we all know, is very structured, whether it's the 9 to 5 or whatever. Time is taken from us, and the whole cliche idea, you get back, you're so tired, you haven't got time to do anything but, sleep and eat or sit like a zombie in front of a TV or whatever it is that someone might do. So he talks about these other times, and for me, this almost becomes like a form of anthropo techniques, right? Where we're linking the self to this other time, this other space, where there these forms of minuscule machines that we can use to like forge ahead with our own aesthetics away from a consensual space and time. So I don't know if that makes sense. It all sounds a little bit abstract, and in a sense it is, because aesthetic communities are non-locational.
Yeah. So, A big focus of socialism and Marxism, of course, is the focus of solidarity.
Yeah,
I wanted to ask you how, these desensual aesthetic communities, although they're not locatable in a spatial physical locality per se,
yeah,
how do you characterize their solidarity? Or are they really not best to be thought of vis-a-vis a is solidarity a concept that could fit within Rancier's kind of philosophy, Because that's one challenge again for me, which is uh I feel like, you know, liberal politics does a damn good
yeah,
job of making everyone atomized workers, atomized
yeah,
entrepreneurs, right?
yeah,
Eh,
yeah,
eh,
yeah,
eh, So, okay, what Rancière is talking about is a form of aesthetic solidarity, you could say.
yeah.
What does that look like? And maybe does Rancière give any examples of such desensual aesthetic communities that come to mind for you?
Um, there's an example that he gives, or I can't, if I can try and find it here. Okay, so example I have here, Rancière exemplifies how art can unite people, and that's linked obviously to the aesthetic. With his citation story about a Cuban artist, Rene Francisco, who was given a grant to explore the poverty of suburban slums in Havana, but ended up with fellow artists refurbishing an old woman's home. The artists worked as masons, plumbers, and painters. Okay, so that's one example where, quite literally, aesthetically, to the extreme, there were artists ended up doing something else to refurbish an old lady's home. But there's a certain solidarity, I would say, in the sense that everyone's experienced the same kind of like biography, if you like with Gourney, everyone's like, struggling worker in abstract poverty. And there's a solidarity in that sense. There's a solidarity in they want to have a life, another way of being, but there's not. I'm finding it so hard to articulate. I think that the block that a lot of people, including Todd May and other thinkers, have is like, but this is not leading anywhere. Where is it going? I mean, there's no where's the emancipation? It's not leading anywhere. Maybe aesthetic revolution goes nowhere, but and that's why it's individual very much. But again, with the linking to aesthetic communities, it's autotelic. It's a self-end. Why does one presuppose equality and practice equality? Because one practices equality, because they presuppose equality. There's no
Yeah.
telos there, right? So there's a solidarity of sorts, but I think people are so conditioned through the Enlightenment, of having this dialectic of progress, and when you don't have that, it's quite confounding for someone, and that's what I think makes people maybe get confused or frustrated with Rancière, I think.
Yeah, because in a certain way, if we take the kind of exemplar of Goni, it's not really fair or possible, I think, to say that he gives us the rudiments or the fabric by which we would then create a community in common. But rather, it's a kind of logic of more of a kind of negativity, in the sense that if each subject, right, like there is solidarity in alienation, right? I mean, I feel that this is a fundamental Marxist truth in some sense, in the sense that we share a point of exclusion, like that sharing of exclusion, and the recognition of that fact becomes the basis of something. But the aesthetic production that we are each engaged in and so on may have some capacity to move us or something like that. Like it very much interests me, because like the Soviets in the Bolshevik period, they experimented with this same thing, like proletkult, and I in my book on Nietzsche, I examined the myths and the festivals, the worker festivals that they developed. And you have this tradition stretching back to Rousseau, right? These kind of counter hegemonic, ludic celebrations and festivals that form a community, in an outlaw community, right? But Rancière is kind of talking along these lines, but he's talking about also how those communities also form otherness to themselves. And that's what I find very interesting about his imminent critique of socialism and Marxism in an interesting way. My next question is to actually ask about Rancière's theory of the intellectual, if I could. We know from The Philosopher and His Poor that Rancière gives us a sort of through line, if you like, a kind of genealogy of the place of worker intellectuals in their subordination to so-called master intellectuals. And towards the end of that book, I was struck through his critique of sociology, right? And he thinks that like philosophy, like sociology also has this problem, right? Where they sort of, the sociologist relies on a caricature, maybe, or a kind of, the
working class.
I wanted to ask you how you feel about that. Like, you yourself recently finished university, and maybe you could speak for yourself, or however you wish. Like, what does that mean to you? In other words, like do academics, it's sort of, because he's sort of making a claim about academic discourse as well. I mean, it's sociology, but it's really probably could be extended beyond. What does that actually mean regarding one's place within the academic machinery as a marginal academic, or from a certain background, let's say? Like, how does that work for you?
Well, let's just say briefly, we know that academics are treated atrociously now, and zero chance for tenure, and so on and so forth. And everything's really neoliberal in universities. So we can say this, but it's not a great time to be an academic. But anyway, so I finished university 2 years ago, my PhD. And just a quick biography. You talking about you being, coming from a working class background. Mine is extremely working class. I left school at 15. I did my BA when I was like 37, finished when I was 40. And for a long time, I didn't have money to do an MA. When I eventually did, I did an MA, and then I went straight on to a PhD. So I resonate very strongly with, like, say, for example, like Guni. All right, he didn't go to university, but I think for me, one of the skills that university teaches you is the ability to be autodidactic, to be able to teach yourself. Yeah, okay. But going back to what you're saying about sociology and, like, Bourdieu, his critique of Bourdieu, that Pierre Bourdieu, that you're this elite academic. I mean, with Bourdieu, it's important to understand that Rancière is not arguing against the veracity of Bourdieu's work. He's not saying it's wrong what he says, right? He's arguing against the like Bourdieu says, the underprivileged don't do academically well because of their habitus, and academia, reproduces and legitimizes inequalities through the class system. Rancière is not disagreeing with that so much. He's more about the effect of Bourdieu's work, which, as you said, he becomes this intellectual elite himself, the very thing he criticizes about, education. And for Rancière, maybe it's a bit trite to say, but it's almost as if he's like using the working class to represent himself as the educated other, and therefore giving him that job, supposed to speak to, tell them what their truth is. And maybe that's why Rancière stays away from the truth, right, and talks more about poetics and so on and so forth, rather than a truth, or even a philosophy. So in that sense, um, I would have to agree with Rancière, but in personal experiences, like in university and so forth, I mean, I didn't particularly come across with that. I didn't meet an Althusser, if you like, as Rancière critiques Althusser for, which, I mean, Bourdieu gets critiqued for similar reasons that Althusser does, much the same. So personally, I didn't, but that's kind of where he's coming from with his critique of sociology and Bourdieu, the same as Althusser, this elite academic giving their truth to the working class about what it is and what they should do. They're a pedagogue, right? That's what they are in the end. They're didactic. They're not taking into account that these people, these mass they want to call the working class or whatever, can be autodidactic. Okay, and that's where the true emancipation takes place.
That is interesting, Stu. If you think about the common sense of how that hierarchy appears. For example, it's very common to hear people say, well, if you want to speak about intellectual topics with a working class audience, it's best to dumb it down.
Mm. Yeah.
And I feel like that's a very Rancièrean point, because that presupposes there is no presupposition of equality. That you see the point. That claim
presupposes inequality. Yeah.
It presupposes inequality. It's like Rancière's very funny point, which is the question, do you understand?
Yeah.
Should be understood as an interrogative that presupposes inequality. As a pedagogy, right?
Mm.
I thought that's very true, right?
Mm.
And therefore, a lesson that I've always taken from his thought, because I encounter in the United States, in my background, I always encounter this idea, which is I get accused of using language that is foreign. Concepts and words, not a foreign language, but like people make a distinction between book knowledge and practical knowledge. And I feel like worker autodidacts upend that common sense. They challenge that common sense. And that's good, because that common sense is itself an expression of an inegalitarian hierarchy, in my opinion. So I've always wanted to challenge that, and Rancière kind of helps me challenge that some way, at least in the world of thought, because I feel like, as you said, the Ignorant Schoolmaster book, that idea that you don't that you need a kind of the most minimal pedagogy in order to become an autodidact. That's a very powerful concept, and I think that it's powerful because it's so stridently anti-elitist. Have you experienced similar things with when people learn that you have that you're a PhD? How has Rancière helped you? Or maybe you haven't thought about this. If you have, I invite you to comment, with this precise point, with these, let's call it the fact that people do not presuppose equality. How has Rancière, has he helped you in this regard? Does that make sense? Maybe he has, maybe he hasn't. I don't know.
For me, I think one of the reasons I resonated with Rancière and Corny is because I saw a lot of myself in them that I wasn't aware of or able to articulate. And I'm like, kind of, okay, so that's what I was doing. Yeah, I have been an autodidactic for a long time for various reasons. And I have presupposed equality for various reasons, and it's ongoing. It's a classic Socrates thing that the more you know, all that you know is you know nothing. I mean, someone might argue, I've done a PhD in philosophy, you know something, right? And I would say, I don't think I know much. There's a lot more I got to learn. It's ongoing. And like when you do learn about these things, you're like, how did I not know that? That which you don't see becomes obvious all of a sudden, and it appears everywhere. Uh, anyway, so I think it never led me anywhere. It was almost a confirmation of, oh, I'm not the only one to feel like this. Other people feel like this too. Other people want to find, this use the word truth is loaded, but another truth, yeah, and want to emancipate themselves from a particular way of thinking and seeing. That I grew up in the working class, that I always used to feel like I don't belong here. I don't know where I do belong. I don't want to be in any class, right? Because like Rancière talks about that, actually, like, you know, a few of these worker poets wanted to be the bourgeoisie, right? This is what my terrible French pronunciation, but Jean-Paul Sartre calls the amphibian, yeah? They want to go from working class, go to another world, okay? This is not the case with Gourny, by the way. And that was not the case with me. I don't want to be middle class. I don't want to be any class. I just, yeah, I don't want, as Rancière would say, this taxonomy imposed upon me. So a de-identification he talks about, right, rather than stress on identification. So as does Foucault. So it resonated with me in the sense that these are lots of things that I've done in my life, and I felt like Rancière so eloquently encaptures for me. Maybe that's kind of what I'm striving to be, this worker poet, in a sense. If you want to emancipate yourself, we're all worker poets, right? Okay, we all work, we have to feed ourselves, but we've got this like devoir double consciousness where we strive towards our essential self as well. And how can we do that? If we want to feed ourselves, we can do it immanent, which is the perfect word that you chose earlier on. So I don't know if I'm being very concise, but that's kind of, you know,
no, it's good.
Why
I'm inviting you to kind of have an extemporaneous response, and I think you're resonating with me quite a lot, because I feel like university creates a space where the presupposition to equality is not present so often. But that really depends on the teacher, maybe.
Yeah.
Right. In other words, most of the time, well, it's very, very, very hard to inhabit that pedagogy whereby the presupposition can be posited and where it can work. Right. I would say the online space, if done well, could lend itself to something like that, you know, because I feel like part of what Rancière's theory of equality is about is having a critique of institutions, right? Like, in other words, there is an implicit theory of class power and knowledge and transmission that he has given us here. And and frankly, in an age where so many people from working class backgrounds are not really allowed to go to the university, you could envision institutions emerging that would incorporate a Rancièrean pedagogy, to promote a form of emancipation, whether in the form of study, you know what I mean, or some kind of program for learning that's not tied to the instrumentalized neoliberal university and its market demands.
So where do I start with this? So when I was at university, just briefly, and then I move on, working class guy, but you know, it's totally a middle class regime. Right? That's what university is. Okay, working class people don't go. When I was 15, I didn't take any exams. I left at 15. You're supposed to leave at 16 in the UK. That's the earliest I used to work and take exams. I didn't take any, but it didn't even appear in my mind at all of going to university. I didn't know anybody who'd been to university. It just, within that sphere, that's no one goes. Okay, so it's very much middle class. We all know that. So, but when you talk about he's very much against the institutions. That's correct, but he's also against the institutionalization, as I said, when it comes to a critique of Todd May, where he wants to institutionalize a presupposition of equality. He's against that because once you institutionalize it, it becomes the very opposite of that which it is. Yeah. So when you start talking,
wait, hold on. Okay, sorry. Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
That's very interesting, Stu. What does that mean, though? Like, what? I kind of sympathize with Todd May.
Yeah. I mean, Todd May is kind of, I would say, hijacking Rancière to a degree because of his anarchist project, like Todd May's all for like anarchism, right? Okay. And he kind of hijacks that for his anarchist project. That would be, not just mine, but others' critique of what he does with his book on Rancière. He explains Rancière very well. I think he was probably the first person to write a commentary book actually on Rancière. So he did a lot to open up Rancière for discussion, but he hijacks him for his anarchist project. And Rancière is not an anarchist. Okay, he states so himself. But
what does Rancière call himself politically? Does he have a label? Does he say he's communist, right?
I think he says he's communist, but not in the sense that we would typically understand. But he says he's anarchist in the sense that it's the dissensus, right? It's all about politics as dissensus, not politics as police or as government. But he's not an anarchist. And I would say, in a way, it's quite ironic to try and classify someone who's against classification, if that makes sense. I mean, one could even argue, he might even say, well, I'm not even a philosopher because I use history and different subjects to go together and so on and so forth. I mean, no thinkers like to be classified, Foucault or otherwise. So when you talk about an institutionalized of Rancière's kind of pedagogy, well, I mean, I would argue that Rancière's focus isn't even on pedagogy, right? It's just a medium that he uses, he hijacks Jacotot to a degree, right? Because this is not really quite where Jacotot's coming from for his own means. And to say, look, supposition of intelligence, a presupposition of equality. So I know people have written about this, ignorant schoolmaster and so on and so forth for pedagogy and education, but I don't really think that that's what Rancière's focus is on. It's not on education, institutionalized education as emancipation. It's on autodidactic education as a form of emancipation. So he's not really like what's the famous Brazilian pedagogue who talks about
Paulo Freire.
Paulo, he's not like Paulo Freire. No,
I understand. Well, he may not be like Freire, but I don't think that would preclude us or prevent us from, I feel that Rancière's thought is meant to be applied. Yeah. Maybe not as a program. Definitely not as a program, right?
Maybe as a practice.
As a practice, as a practice, right? So you're reading Rancière, you're an intellectual of some sort, right? You're engaged in scholarship of some sort. Of course, it's going to have an influence on you as a teacher.
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
there's no way around that fact. Yeah. So this is the singularity that I wanted this conversation to bring out about Rancière, because again, as I said at the very beginning, I do think that people read Rancière ideologically. They say, oh, he's French theory, he's anti-Marxist, he's this, he's that, right? I don't want to read him that way. I want to read him much more. He's very Socratic to me in a certain way. The concept of the gadfly, like the fly on the horse that the horse cannot swat, right? I feel like that's what Rancière is for the emancipatory tradition, as we said it before, and that's how he should be, right? he's not like some neat thinker that fits your box and helps you XYZ. No. Rancière disrupts all of your assumptions.
Yeah.
In some way. Yeah. I don't know how you see him. Maybe in closing, you might say something more about him for you, and any other reflections that you may have.
Yeah. Well, what, as cliche as it may sound, Rancière does is he encourages you to think for yourself, to find your own path of emancipation, because that changes and morphs for the individual and the time frame, geography of where you find yourself. So very much like Socrates, as you said, that's a good analogy. He wants you to think for yourself and experiment with new ways of experiencing the world and everything around you. So I mentioned in my book that you talk about Socrates, but Rancière is sort of, in a way, adopts the myotic approach, but he's not questioning you as an interlocutor as Socrates did, but he kind of traces the indeterminate path that allows an individual through their own auto-emancipation and their will to question the self. Yeah, the self as a question and a problem to itself, as Augustine has mentioned, without getting too much on the Christian vein. So this is what he's encouraging. He's encouraging autonomy. Okay, and autonomy of the self and autonomy of emancipation, which most people don't like because they go, it's all about the individual, and but that's what he's offering. Now, whether that leads anywhere and it causes ripples in aesthetic communities and so on and so forth. There's a guy, I don't know if it's pronounced Patrick Singolani or Patrick Singolani, who talks about the cenobitic economy of Gournay and the precariat, the term precariat, which is a mixture of like the proletariat and precarious. Okay, it's a portmanteau. That this can call maybe seeds of politics for those without part. It can cause ripples. We don't know where it will lead, but this is Rancière's whole thing when he's getting away from political philosophy. I'm not here to offer you and say this is how it is and this is where it will go. I'm the ignorant schoolmaster, right? If you're Rancière, he's the ignorant schoolmaster. I don't know. Like the ignorant schoolmaster didn't understand Flemish, but he was teaching Flemish students, right, with a bilingual book. He was ignorant of that which he was teaching. Okay, and Rancière he's the ignorant schoolmaster. He doesn't have an answer. No one has an answer, right, to an egalitarian society. And Rancière would argue that society, by its very premise, functions on a presupposition of inequality. How could it not? Functions on that. So you can be equal in an unequal society, or you could be unequal in an equal society, if that makes sense. And we start thinking about communist societies, and so on, USSR, and so on and so forth. So there's no answer. It's there for you to go out and do the work yourself, and that's kind of maybe in a Socratic way, as you say, that's what he's offering. That makes sense.
Absolutely, Stuart. It's very much worth the time to read the work of Jacques Rancière. I think also that as a stylist, is very clear writing. That's why it's not like a lot of these French theory people. It's not like some high.
It's not Hegel.
Well, it's not Lacan too. It's not.
Yeah, it's not Lacan. Yeah, that's for sure.
he does want to make it easy on his reader, and the concepts are often written in forms of theses. Even his more theoretical texts are difficult, but not impossible to comprehend.
Sure.
You know.
Yeah.
So I think that Rancier's thought. Could you say something in conclusion about Rancière today? Like, have there been any works in recent times, like, for example, like the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement in France, this worker uprising, which has been baffling to many on the left for many reasons. I know Rancière has weighed in on them. Are there other interventions that he's made that have struck you or in recent times? Any observations, impressions?
I would say no, and I'm definitely not up to the very latest work on Rancière. I wouldn't say I'm, a Rancièrean commentator. But I will say the thing that strikes me the most is now, because of neoliberalism, we are more and more and more moving to the vast disparities of wealth and so on and so forth of the early 19th century. It's sad but true. So very much what he says, Guni and so on and so forth, is very, very relevant now. Yeah, we're going back to those times because of neoliberalism. So it's very apt. It's not of a time past and you probably would say disagree, but like Foucault in The Order of Things says, Marxism outside of the 19th century is like a fish out of water. Yeah, it's the famous critique that Foucault makes. I'm sure you disagree, but it's not like that in that sense. I think what he says, dealing with the 19th century, Rancière and Gournay and worker poets and autodidactism, autotelism, dissensus is very much act for the now, and sadly, neoliberal return to like almost a Victorian era of huge disparities and like the disappearance of cliched of the middle class, where it's still rich and the poor.
Right.
So in that sense, I think it's very apt for now.
No, definitely. I feel this is why I felt his choice to focus an archival research on that period of time is very interesting, because Alain Badiou, one of Rancière's contemporaries, he will frequently say the wealth disparities and the inequality of contemporary capitalism is very close to 1848. And he also says that is true because the workers' movement was basically unorganized before 1848, like it is today. It was sort of sporadic, and there was no centralized international, for example, right? There was no real organization, and that's a lot. And also there was a lot of spontaneous insurrections that didn't materialize. Yeah. It's very interesting, by the way, and then we'll close, that you say that Rancière said that for these autodidact worker intellectuals, revolution was a struggle. It made their lives even more chaotic when they were actually wanting a stability that was foreclosed to them. That's a very that's not an anti-revolutionary idea, but it is a humbling point about. Yeah, it's about, I take that to mean something about, like, let's say the desire of the worker, right?
Yeah.
What is the desire of the worker? It's not immediately for some sacrifice to let the world burn down. Exactly, right? Anyways, Stuart, I just want to thank you for joining me on this podcast. I hope that everyone has gotten a better feel for Jacques Rancière's work as a result of this conversation. I certainly really benefited from your work. I'm excited for your book to come out. Do you have a date when the book will be released?
December this year. December.
Okay.
I think it's the 12th. I think, but it's out on December the 12th, and it's synergy of practices of equality and freedom using the work of Rancière and Foucault, and Goni acts as a nexus connecting these two thinkers and freedom and equality. And it's well, I'm biased, but it's an interesting skew on things. So yeah,
it's really good. Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you very much.
Excited. I hope it goes well, and
Me
that
too.
you know, that it starts these kinds of conversations.
Yeah.
So I think we'll close unless there's any final thoughts that you haven't expressed that you want to state before we close.
Not particularly. I'd just like to thank you for your time and bringing this to the table, and for your knowledgeable and articulate way of guiding this conversation and bringing out the salient points that needed to be out. So thank you for your skill in doing that, and in your time for talking to me about what I believe to be a very important thinker, Rancière. But what I would say, one little thing I want to add that's just come to mind, that when I wrote, I think you read one of my essays, right? Like Aesthetics and Politics, Jacques Rancière and Louis-Gabriel Goni. People I knew who read it said, "Oh, I'm aware of Rancière, but I never knew this guy Goni. Who's Goni?" So that was interesting, because I would argue that if you want to understand Rancière, you need to understand Goni and his work of poets. Otherwise, I don't think, you know, all of a sudden I'm becoming like the pedagogue.
Yeah, no,
I think you'd have a deeper understanding of Rancière if you have an understanding of his work of poets.
Well, it's an interesting. Yeah, you're right. It's an interesting method that Rancière takes to these work of poets, because you say in your book that he treats them at the same level of seriousness as most readers treat the canon figures like Plato.
Yeah.
He's reading Goni at the same level of possible insight, as the master, so-called master figures,
philosophers,
right. And that's a beautiful
it's amazing.
Yeah. And I think, you know, the quotations of the excerpts of Goni that you read from Rancière, there's some very profound insights. In fact, it's not like Goni's thought is somehow less. No, I think Rancière is trying to show that one can extract a profundity from this, but then the profundity you would extract would have to also probably recognize that it is delivered to a different regime of your sensibility. So therefore it challenges you. Some say, you know, you see my point.
I mean, Goni was talking about like the panoptician and so on, like obviously way before Foucault and prison reforms. And I mean, he truly is a philosopher, a self-acclaimed plebeian philosopher, he says. But I mean, he talks about the panoptician being prisons, and then it's being used in the workplace. All of these things that like Foucault speaks about, like it makes you wonder, did Foucault ever read Goni? Obviously not, because Goni was hidden in the archives, and then in the work of Rancière becomes a revenant, right? He's brought back to life, okay, because he was unheard of. No one, I think there were a couple of old essays. One's about 60, 70 years old. One's about 100 years old on Goni. Other than that, Goni was unheard of. So he's, in his own right, he's definitely worth reading. And there's an edition of an edited book by Rancière on, as I said, on Goni's own work. Unfortunately, for some, it's only available in French, though. So
yeah. Well, Stuart, I think we'll close. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. Thank you,
very
Daniel.
much enjoyed it. Everyone must check out Stuart Blaney's new book, which I will link to in the show notes. Thanks, everyone.